A legacy of change. The weeks following her public outcry were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and press releases. Rachel had become more than just a figurehead in the media, she had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. What started as a personal battle had transformed into a national conversation, one that refused to be ignored. By the time the airline's internal reforms began to take shape, Rachel had already made her mark. She had traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, meeting with advocates for racial justice, and lending her voice to causes that resonated deeply with her. She had become a beacon of hope for those who had long felt marginalized by the very systems meant to serve them. But through all the media attention and accolades, Rachel remained grounded in the simple truth that her fight wasn't over. As she prepared for her final meeting with the airline's leadership team, Rachel reflected on how far she had come. She had spent the last few weeks drafting a detailed report with recommendations on how the airline could move forward. These weren't just suggestions based on her own experience, but insights from a broader range of voices, from fellow passengers to industry experts and advocates. She knew that true change wouldn't happen through one-off policy adjustments or empty gestures. It would take a deep, systemic transformation. Rachel's final meeting with the airline's executive team took place in the high-rise boardroom of Atlantic Air's headquarters. The sleek, modern space stood in stark contrast to the emotions that Rachel felt as she walked in. She had spent months working on this project, ensuring that every voice was heard and that no corner was left unexplored. The team had been waiting for her. Marcus Davenport, the CEO, stood to greet her, his usual confident demeanor tempered with a sense of solemnity. Beside him was the Chief Diversity Officer, Michelle Reynolds, a woman with a long history in corporate social responsibility. They were joined by a few other senior leaders, all eager to hear the final recommendations Rachel had crafted. "Ms. Carter," Marcus began, offering his hand in a firm handshake. "We are incredibly grateful for the time and effort you've put into this process. Your contributions have been invaluable in helping us understand the depth of the issues we face and how we can begin to address them. We know it's been a long road, but we're here today because of your perseverance." Rachel nodded but didn't offer the same warmth in return. She appreciated the acknowledgement, but words weren't what mattered. She had seen too many companies pay lip service to diversity and inclusion without implementing meaningful changes. What she needed to hear was a commitment to real action. "I'm glad we could get to this point," Rachel replied, her voice steady. "But I need to be clear with you. This can't just be a series of checkboxes. You need to understand that this is a long-term commitment, not a short-term fix. You can't just put out a press release and think that's enough. You need to transform your entire organizational culture." There was a pause as Marcus and Michelle exchanged looks. Rachel could sense the weight of her words settling in, but she wasn't going to back down now. "We've already begun implementing some of the changes you recommended," Marcus said. "We've rolled out new anti-bias training across the company, and we're restructuring our hiring practices to ensure more diversity at all levels of the organization. But we know there's more work to be done." Rachel glanced at the group, her gaze sharp. "And that's the problem. You're focusing on individual issues when the systemic problem is much deeper. This isn't just about hiring the right people or training employees. This is about rethinking your entire approach to customer service. It's about how you view your passengers, not just as paying customers, but as human beings worthy of respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It's about looking at your gate agents and staff and asking, do they understand what it means to treat every passenger equally? It's about questioning the biases embedded in every interaction, every policy, and every decision. This is an institutional problem, and it won't be solved by just one department or one initiative." Rachel opened her folder and began laying out her detailed report, which included specific recommendations on how to build a more inclusive airline. It wasn't just about revising current policies but about developing a comprehensive framework that would hold employees accountable at every level. First, Rachel began, pointing to a slide on the projector, you need to integrate bias training into your hiring process. This goes beyond just recognizing overt racism or sexism. It's about understanding the subtle biases that people may carry unconsciously and how they impact decision-making. Every employee, from the gate agent to the senior executive, needs to undergo regular, mandatory training on this. The room was quiet as Rachel spoke, but she could feel the shift in their energy. This wasn't just another meeting for them, it was a wake-up call. Second, your company needs a clear, accessible reporting system for passengers to file complaints when they feel discriminated against. The system should be transparent, with a clear process for investigating claims and holding the responsible parties accountable. Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowed. We have a reporting system in place already, but it's clear that it hasn't been effective. We'll work on making that process more visible and streamlined. Good, Rachel replied, her eyes not leaving his. But it's not just about making it easier for people to complain, it's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable reporting bias without fear of retaliation. You need to build trust in the system. Michelle Reynolds spoke up, and what about the accountability aspect? How do we ensure that real change happens and isn't just a public relations effort? Rachel turned to face Michelle, grateful for the directness of her question. You need to measure progress. Implement annual audits that assess how well your policies are being adhered to. Have external, independent organizations review your progress to ensure that you're not just paying lip service to diversity and inclusion but truly living it. Publicly share the results of these audits, so passengers and employees alike know that you're committed to transparency. The conversation continued for several more hours, with Rachel presenting her ideas and the airline leadership asking tough questions. It wasn't an easy discussion. There were moments of tension, moments of pushback, and moments of realization that the changes Rachel was demanding would require a fundamental shift in the company's culture. But Rachel didn't let up. She knew that this was the only way forward. By the end of the meeting, the airline leadership had committed to making significant changes, but Rachel knew that the road ahead would be long. It wouldn't be enough to simply update training materials or tweak existing policies. What was needed was a deeper, cultural transformation, one that could only happen if everyone, from the top down, embraced the idea that equality and fairness were non-negotiable. In the months that followed, Rachel continued to stay involved, working alongside Atlantic Air's leadership to monitor the progress of the changes she had helped implement. It wasn't always easy, and there were setbacks, but the changes were undeniable. Passengers began to feel more heard, more respected, and the staff at Atlantic Air began to realize the power of empathy in customer service. As Rachel continued her advocacy work, she saw other companies starting to take note. More and more organizations were following the example set by Atlantic Air, creating policies that promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rachel knew that her battle had sparked something bigger than a single incident, it had ignited a movement. Her fight wasn't just about holding one airline accountable, it was about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their background, would never again have to endure the kind of humiliation she had faced. It was about leaving a legacy of change that would impact generations to come. And as she looked out at the world she had helped shape, Rachel Carter knew that her work had only just begun. The public outcry. Rachel walked out of the private meeting room with a sense of cautious optimism. She knew she had made a powerful statement, but the true test would lie in how the airline followed through. As she made her way back to the terminal, she took a deep breath, knowing that the real challenge was just beginning. The next step was clear, to hold the airline accountable not just in the meeting room, but in the court of public opinion. Once she reached her apartment, Rachel sat down and began to craft a message that she hoped would resonate far beyond the immediate confines of the incident. The feeling of injustice, the casual disregard for her dignity, and the underlying racial bias had fueled a fire inside her that couldn't be extinguished by a mere apology. She didn't just want justice for herself, she wanted to make sure that the discriminatory treatment she had faced would not be forgotten by the public. She opened her laptop, taking a moment to compose herself before she began typing. The message had to be strong, clear, and backed by the truth of her experience. It was time to tell her story. On December 10, I was unfairly accused of using a fake first-class ticket by an airline employee. I was humiliated in front of other passengers, subjected to unnecessary scrutiny, and my dignity was called into question. What should have been a routine check-in became an opportunity for racial prejudice to rear its ugly head. But this is not just about me. It's about every person who has ever been questioned, scrutinized, or made to feel unworthy of their place, simply because of their race or appearance. The behavior I experienced is not an isolated incident, it is part of a larger, systemic issue that continues to affect countless individuals every day. It's time to stop turning a blind eye and start demanding better. I am not the first person to experience this type of discrimination, and I won't be the last unless we take a stand. We must hold the people in positions of power accountable for their actions. It's not enough to offer empty apologies or to promise to do better. We need to see real change, action, accountability, and a commitment to treating every person with respect, no matter their race, gender, or background. I am sharing my experience not for sympathy, but for solidarity. I hope that others who have faced similar treatment will speak out. Together, we can make sure that this doesn't happen again. We deserve better, and it's time we demand it. She took a moment to read over the post, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The weight of her words was undeniable, but Rachel knew that sharing her story was the only way to make a real impact. She pressed post. Almost immediately, her social media accounts were flooded with messages of support. Friends, family, and strangers alike offered words of encouragement. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others expressed outrage at the treatment she had endured. The post quickly went viral, with people across the globe joining in the conversation. In the days that followed, Rachel's story gained traction in the media. News outlets picked up on the viral post, and she was soon interviewed by multiple television stations and news websites. The airline was forced to issue a public statement in response, which, while apologetic, was criticized for being too vague and lacking concrete commitments to address the issue. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. Social media erupted with #StandWithRachel hashtags, and many people pledged to boycott the airline until they took real action to address the racial bias that had been exposed. The hashtag quickly became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar treatment and for those who believed in fairness and justice. One of the most poignant moments came when a video surfaced of another passenger at the airport, who had witnessed Rachel's interaction with Susan Miller. The woman, who had been hesitant to speak out at the time, came forward and publicly stated that she had seen the blatant discrimination. The video went viral, adding fuel to the fire and forcing the airline to take a more serious look at its practices. Within the next week, Rachel received a call from the airline's CEO, Marcus Davenport. He was eager to speak with her personally. "Ms. Carter," Marcus began, his tone sincere but heavy with the pressure of the situation, "I want to personally apologize for what happened. I've been following the media coverage and reading the reports, and I can't begin to imagine the distress this caused you. I want you to know that we take this matter very seriously, and we are committed to making changes within the organization." Rachel listened carefully. She had heard these words before, but there was something in Marcus's voice that suggested he wasn't just offering a scripted apology. He seemed genuinely concerned, and that was a first step. "I appreciate the apology," Rachel replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "But apologies alone aren't enough. This situation isn't just about me. It's about every single person who has been marginalized or treated unfairly. It's time for real, systemic change." "I understand," Marcus said. "And that's why I'm reaching out to you. I'd like to invite you to help us in crafting new policies and procedures that will address the issues of discrimination and bias in our airline. We are going to review every aspect of our hiring process, staff training, and passenger interactions. I want you to be part of this." Rachel was taken aback. She had expected some kind of appeasement, but this was different. The CEO was asking her to be part of the solution, to help shape a new future for the airline. It wasn't a perfect offer, but it was a significant step toward the change she had been demanding. "I'm glad to hear that you're taking this seriously," Rachel said. "But I want to make sure that these changes are not just lip service. I want to see measurable progress. I want the world to know that the airline is committed to creating an environment where discrimination has no place. It starts with action." Marcus paused, then said, "You're right. And we're ready to take that action. I want to meet with you and your team as soon as possible. Together, we can make sure this doesn't happen again." Rachel agreed to meet with Marcus and his team. But before she did, she knew she had one more task to accomplish. She wanted to ensure that those who had witnessed the injustice at Gate 27 also had a platform to share their stories. Her goal was not just to fix one incident but to raise awareness about the broader, pervasive issues of bias and discrimination that too many people still faced. Rachel continued to use her platform to highlight the stories of others. She shared posts from people who had experienced similar challenges in different industries, urging them to speak out. She encouraged people to stand up for their rights, to refuse to be treated as less than they were. As the weeks passed, the airline began to implement some of the changes Marcus had promised. They introduced new diversity and inclusion training for all employees, and a new protocol was established for handling complaints of discrimination. But Rachel knew that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough for the airline to simply acknowledge the issue, they had to be held accountable every step of the way. Her journey had just begun. The investigation unfolds. As Rachel settled back into her seat, her mind replayed the events at Gate 27. Each word Susan had spoken, each glance she had thrown in Rachel's direction, and every moment of doubt cast on her right to be there felt like a reminder of the prejudice that still thrived in places where fairness should have been paramount. Despite the luxury of the first-class cabin surrounding her, Rachel knew that the fight for equality was never confined to a single moment or a singular space. It was everywhere. Hours passed, and the hum of the engines blended with the rhythmic clinking of ice in drink glasses, but Rachel's thoughts didn't stray from the conversation she had had with Angela Pierce. The airline had promised an investigation, but she couldn't help but wonder how deep the bias ran within their system. Was Susan's behavior just an isolated incident? Or was it a reflection of a larger, systemic issue within the airline, and perhaps, society at large? Rachel's phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message notification from Angela Pierce. The message was short, but it carried the weight of what was to come. "Ms. Carter, I've spoken with the personnel involved. We've reviewed the footage from Gate 27, and I would appreciate your cooperation in providing any additional documentation that you feel is necessary. We are taking this matter very seriously. More details to follow." Rachel felt a surge of mixed emotions. Part of her was relieved to hear that the airline had already started reviewing the footage and taking action. The other part of her, though, remained skeptical. Words alone wouldn't fix the underlying issues. She had to ensure that this wasn't just a superficial apology, but the beginning of real change. Rachel tapped out a response. "Thank you, Angela. I appreciate the swift action. I'll review everything on my end and send any relevant documentation. I also request a follow-up meeting as soon as possible, as I want to make sure this issue is fully addressed." With that, Rachel set her phone aside. She knew that her journey wasn't just about her, and the battle for equity wasn't fought alone. Other people needed to understand what had transpired and stand in solidarity with her. She thought about her career, the various clients she had represented as an attorney, and the cases that had required not just legal knowledge, but the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. This was no different. What had happened at the gate wasn't just an unfortunate incident, it was a challenge to how society viewed people like her, and she couldn't let it slide. The next morning, after landing, Rachel was escorted off the plane by an airline representative and led to a private room where she would meet with the airline's management team. Her heart pounded with anticipation. The manager, Mark Benson, whom she had spoken with briefly on the phone, was already waiting for her in the room. Beside him stood Angela Pierce and two other individuals, one of whom Rachel recognized as the airport security officer who had been present when Susan Miller was attempting to call for further verification. The other was a woman she didn't know, but her presence suggested she was involved in resolving sensitive matters. "Ms. Carter," Mark began, offering a handshake as she walked into the room. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I'm glad you could join us today. Please, have a seat." Rachel sat across from them, her back straight, her posture confident. She had made her decision. There was no turning back. If she was going to make this right, if she was going to hold Susan and the airline accountable for the mistreatment, she had to stay firm and resolute. "We've reviewed the footage from yesterday's incident at Gate 27, Angela began, her tone respectful. "We've also had a chance to speak with Susan Miller and the security officers involved, as well as a few passengers who were near you during the exchange. We want to assure you that we take any form of discrimination very seriously." Rachel nodded but didn't speak immediately. Her patience was the steady force she relied on, and she could see that the wheels were turning within the management team. They weren't dismissing her concerns, but she still felt a lingering sense of uncertainty. Would they really address the issue in a meaningful way, or would this be just another corporate effort to save face? Mark continued, "We want to start by acknowledging that your experience at the gate was unacceptable. Susan Miller's behavior was not only unprofessional but also discriminatory. It's clear from the footage that she treated you differently from the other passengers. We are in the process of disciplining her, and we will be providing additional training to all frontline staff to ensure that this type of behavior does not happen again." Rachel's jaw tightened. The acknowledgement was important, but she knew better than to accept empty promises. She had heard these words before, from powerful institutions that had claimed to address issues of discrimination, only for it to continue behind closed doors. This was the moment when they needed to prove their commitment, not with words, but with actions. "Thank you for your acknowledgement," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. "But I need more than an apology and training programs. The problem isn't just Susan. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue. Susan may have been the face of it in that moment, but how many others have faced this same bias but lacked the means to speak up?" Angela exchanged a glance with Mark, and Rachel could tell that her words had struck a chord. She could see them processing her concerns, and the room fell into a brief silence. "Ms. Carter," Mark said slowly, his voice thoughtful, "you're right. And we want to do more than just address the issue at hand. We want to make real changes within our company. We've already begun to look at our hiring practices, our staff training, and how we address complaints of discrimination. But we also want to work with you to ensure that these changes are meaningful and sustainable." Rachel's heart raced. This was the moment. She could tell that they were serious, but she wasn't going to allow them to walk away without ensuring that there were concrete steps in place for long-term change. The words had to be backed up with a plan, a commitment that wasn't just going to fade after a few months. "I appreciate your willingness to listen," Rachel said, her voice steady. "But words alone won't change anything. I want a public commitment from the airline that addresses not only Susan's actions but the systemic bias that affects how passengers are treated. I also want to ensure that the employees responsible for this kind of behavior are held accountable, not just through training, but through tangible consequences." Mark nodded. "We're prepared to work with you on a public statement, and we will take full accountability for Susan's actions. As for accountability for other employees, that's something we'll be discussing in our internal meetings. We'll also be working with external experts on diversity and inclusion to help us develop a more comprehensive approach moving forward." Rachel paused before responding, taking in the seriousness of their words. "That's a step in the right direction. But I also want the passengers who were at Gate 27 to know that they are not alone. I want this to serve as a reminder that when someone faces discrimination, they have a voice. I will be reaching out to the media and sharing my experience, not for personal gain, but to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The room went quiet for a moment. The impact of Rachel's words lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. The airline representatives were silent, contemplating what had just been said. But Rachel wasn't done. She knew this was bigger than her. This was about changing the culture, one that perpetuated biases and normalized discrimination. She couldn't afford to let that go. "I'll make sure this isn't forgotten," Rachel said, her voice low but determined. "And I'll be watching closely to see how the airline responds. I'm not just fighting for myself, but for every passenger who has ever been made to feel less than they are." Mark and Angela exchanged another glance, and it was clear that Rachel's message had been heard. The next steps would be crucial, but for the first time since the incident, Rachel felt a sense of hope. Change was possible. It might take time, but with her voice and the support of others, it could be done. As Rachel stood to leave, she gave them one last look. The fight was far from over, but she had taken the first step. And for her, that was enough, for now. The unmasking of bias. As Rachel walked toward the gate, her step steady and deliberate, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers following her every move. There was a quiet murmur that had begun to grow, though no one dared speak too loudly. In the distance, she could see the sleek, polished first-class section of the plane, a symbol of everything she had worked for over the years. She wasn't just any passenger. She had earned this place. And yet, the moment Susan had questioned her, it felt as though her very identity had been scrutinized and weighed by someone who didn't know her, who hadn't walked the same path, who hadn't faced the same struggles. As Rachel approached the gate, she passed through the jet bridge and onto the plane, her body finally relaxing as she entered the familiar environment of luxury and comfort. The plush seats, the soft lighting, and the attentive flight attendants all greeted her like an old friend. But Rachel knew this wasn't just about enjoying the amenities of first class, it was about reclaiming the space that had been challenged. It was about asserting her worth and her right to be treated with the same dignity and respect as any other passenger. She made her way to her seat, her first-class ticket a tangible reminder of all the years she had spent in classrooms, conference rooms, and courtrooms, fighting for justice, equality, and fairness. She had seen the injustices in the world, and now, she was confronting one directly. But as the plane began to fill with passengers, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the conflict at the gate was far from over. This wasn't just a case of an unprofessional airline employee. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. Rachel sank into her seat, adjusting her leather handbag beside her, as she glanced out of the window. The plane was nearing its scheduled departure time, but her mind was still focused on what had transpired at the gate. How many times had this happened before? How many others had experienced the same kind of treatment, the same kind of discrimination, but had remained silent, too afraid to speak up? How many had just accepted the unfair treatment as a normal part of their lives? The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and ensuring the comfort of the passengers. Rachel politely declined, her thoughts still heavy. She didn't want to lose herself in the distractions of luxury. She wanted to make sure that Susan's actions weren't brushed under the rug. She wasn't just going to sit in her seat and forget what had happened. Rachel had a voice, and she would use it to make sure that this injustice was addressed. As the plane ascended, Rachel took out her phone and began reviewing the photos she had taken at the gate. They weren't just a documentation of the moment, they were evidence. Evidence of the biased treatment she had experienced, evidence of the way Susan had treated her differently from the other passengers. She had to make sure that this didn't go unnoticed, that this wasn't swept under the rug like so many other incidents of prejudice that had been ignored. Just as she was about to draft an email to the airline's customer service department, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from an unknown number, but Rachel immediately recognized the area code. It was the airline's headquarters. Her stomach churned with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. This could be the moment when everything came to light, when the airline finally realized the gravity of what had happened. She answered the call, her voice calm but firm. "Hello, this is Rachel Carter." "Good afternoon, Miss Carter," a woman's voice said on the other end. "My name is Angela Pierce, and I'm the Customer Relations Manager at Atlantic Air. I'm calling in reference to an incident that occurred earlier at Gate 27. Can you spare a few minutes to discuss what happened?" Rachel's grip tightened around her phone. She had been expecting this call, but now that it was happening, she found herself momentarily unsure of how to proceed. This was the moment of truth. Would they listen to her, or would they try to cover up Susan's actions? "I'm happy to discuss the situation," Rachel replied, keeping her tone professional. "But I want to make it clear that I'm not just seeking an apology. What happened was deeply unfair, and I expect the airline to take responsibility." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Rachel could almost hear Angela's nervousness. "Of course, Ms. Carter. We take all complaints seriously. We want to understand what happened so we can ensure this doesn't happen again. Could you walk me through the events that led to your treatment at the gate?" Rachel took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I had a valid first-class ticket and was going through the usual boarding process when I was stopped by an employee named Susan Miller. She immediately questioned the authenticity of my ticket without any valid reason, and despite offering to cooperate and providing my documents, she insisted on calling security to verify my information. I was treated differently from the other passengers, and it was clear to me that this was not about the ticket, it was about who I am." Angela listened quietly as Rachel spoke, her voice tight with concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Ms. Carter. That is absolutely not the experience we want any of our passengers to have. I understand that you were made to feel uncomfortable and disrespected. But could you clarify one point for me? You mentioned Susan's behavior toward you was different from the way she treated other passengers. What exactly did you observe?" Rachel's mind immediately returned to the scene at Gate 27, the way Susan had scrutinized her ticket with disdain, the way she had practically waved other passengers through without so much as a second glance. Susan was far more thorough with my ticket than with anyone else. She raised her eyebrows mockingly when she looked at my documents, and she even made a comment about people like me being in first class. But the most troubling part was that she seemed to view me as an anomaly. Like I didn't belong in that space. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Angela spoke again. "I see. Ms. Carter, thank you for sharing that with me. I want to assure you that this is being taken very seriously. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination, and we will be investigating this incident thoroughly. I'll be speaking with both the gate staff and security personnel who were involved, and will ensure that appropriate action is taken." Rachel nodded, even though Angela couldn't see her. "Thank you. But I want to make sure this isn't just a matter of a few words. I want this to lead to real change. It's not just about me, it's about anyone who's ever had to face this kind of bias and been too afraid to speak up." "I understand completely," Angela replied. "We're committed to making sure every passenger feels respected and valued, regardless of their background or appearance. You have my word that we will address this appropriately." As the call ended, Rachel felt a sense of both relief and uncertainty. She had taken the first step in confronting the bias that had stained her experience, but she knew the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning, and the road ahead would require more than just words. It would require action. As she put her phone down and looked out of the window, the vastness of the sky stretched out before her. The clouds were fluffy and white, like cotton candy, and the horizon seemed endless. Rachel knew that her fight was far from over, but she also knew that she was not alone. She had the power of truth on her side, and that was a force that could not be ignored. The struggle for respect. As Rachel stood there, her phone still raised and capturing the unfolding scene, the tension around her only intensified. The passengers waiting in line grew noticeably quieter, some whispering under their breath, others shifting uncomfortably. But Rachel didn't allow herself to be distracted by the murmurs or sideways glances. Her focus was on Susan and the way she was continuing to handle the situation. Rachel had been in countless high-pressure situations before, courtrooms, negotiations, and corporate battles, but this? This was different. This was not just a challenge to her professionalism, it was a challenge to her very identity. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Rachel maintained her calm demeanor, standing tall with her arms crossed and her gaze unwavering. She knew the power of patience. As an attorney, she'd learned long ago that in moments like these, the best weapon was to stay composed. If she reacted emotionally, if she allowed herself to be drawn into Susan's game, then she would lose. And Rachel was not about to lose. The terminal continued to buzz with activity, but Rachel's world had narrowed to the space around her and the woman who had so blatantly questioned her right to be there. Susan had taken a few steps back, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture, her eyes darting nervously between Rachel and the growing crowd. Rachel could sense that Susan was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as she had hoped. A few moments later, two security personnel approached. The first, a tall man with a military-style haircut, moved with authority. His name tag read David Blake, and as he approached, Rachel couldn't help but notice the subtle hesitation in his step. He was aware that something was off here, and he wasn't taking the situation at face value, as Susan had hoped. David's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze moving from Rachel to Susan, and then back again. Susan immediately stepped forward, clearly eager to explain the situation from her point of view. "This passenger is attempting to board with what I believe to be a fake ticket. I've asked her to wait while we verify it, but she's been uncooperative and disruptive." Rachel raised an eyebrow at the accusation. She had not been disruptive, not even remotely. She had simply demanded to be treated fairly. But Rachel didn't say a word. Instead, she glanced at David, her expression steady and composed. "I have a valid ticket," Rachel replied, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "If you need verification, I'm happy to provide it. But I expect to be treated with respect." David glanced between the two women, clearly assessing the situation. He could see the stark contrast in how Susan had treated Rachel versus how she processed the other passengers. He had witnessed this kind of behavior before, quiet prejudice, masked by a veneer of professionalism, and he wasn't buying it. Still, as a security officer, his role wasn't to make judgments, it was to follow protocol. He turned to Susan, his brow furrowing slightly. "Miss Miller, can you tell me exactly what made you doubt this ticket?" Susan hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by David's inquiry. "It just didn't look right," she said, trying to downplay her actions. The way she presented it seemed off. "It's not often we see someone like her in first class." Her words were sharp, tinged with an almost imperceptible disdain. Rachel's breath caught at the insinuation. Someone like her. She had heard those words before, never directly, but they had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Rachel had spent her whole life proving that she belonged in spaces like first class, that she had earned every step of the success she'd attained. But here, in this moment, Susan had reduced her to a mere stereotype. Rachel refused to show any sign of weakness. Instead, she held her head high, her gaze never wavering. "That comment is not only offensive," she said, her voice firm but controlled, "it's also irrelevant to the situation. You're here to verify a ticket, not to judge who belongs in first class." David's eyes flicked to Rachel, a look of understanding passing between them. He had seen this kind of thing before, passengers being treated unfairly because of assumptions about their background or appearance. And while he wasn't about to make a decision on the spot, he could tell that Susan was not handling this situation with the professionalism that was expected of her. Maria Lopez, the second security officer, had been standing quietly to the side, watching the exchange. Her eyes were sharp, and she could tell that something was off. She had been in security for long enough to know when someone was trying to deflect or cover up a mistake. This wasn't about the ticket. This was about something much deeper, something that David Blake was just starting to understand. David turned to Maria. "What do you think?" he asked, his tone quiet but serious. Maria took a step forward, her face set in a neutral expression. "I think Rachel's documents are valid," she said, her voice even. "I don't see anything suspicious here." Susan's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to argue, but Maria raised her hand to stop her. "We've reviewed everything," Maria continued. "Her ID matches her ticket, and there's no reason to delay this any further. Let her board." Susan's eyes flashed with indignation, but she knew she was losing ground. Rachel had been calm, controlled, and patient, while Susan's own actions had revealed a deep-seated bias that had no place in a professional environment. For a moment, Susan seemed at a loss for words. But she quickly recovered, her posture stiffening as she sought to regain control. "I still believe there's cause for concern," Susan insisted. "We don't just let anyone through without verifying everything." David shook his head, his expression firm. "Miss Miller, I think we've verified enough. We're done here." Susan's lips pressed together in frustration, but she didn't argue further. There was nothing more she could say. The facts were clear. Rachel's ticket was legitimate, her identification was valid, and there was no reason to hold her back. Rachel, her eyes still locked on Susan, finally allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was a victory of sorts. She had stood her ground, and for once, her dignity had not been compromised. David turned to Rachel. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his voice sincere. "Please, go ahead. You're cleared to board." Rachel nodded, her eyes still sharp, her posture still straight. "Thank you," she said, her tone cool but composed. She hadn't let Susan's bias break her, and she wasn't about to let it affect her now. She had earned her place in that first-class seat, just as she had earned everything that had brought her here. And as she walked toward the gate, Rachel felt a quiet sense of resolve wash over her. This was just the beginning. The truth had already started to surface. And Rachel Carter was not going to let it be silenced. The unseen challenge. The airport terminal was alive with the usual energy of a busy morning. The atmosphere hummed with the sound of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and the low murmur of travelers caught in the frenzy of catching flights. The sharp clack of heels echoed across the polished floors, and the rhythmic buzz of overhead lights created a constant hum. For most, this was just another day in transit. But for Rachel Carter, this day would be anything but ordinary. Rachel walked through the vast terminal, her gait confident and steady. She wasn't just another business traveler, she was a woman on a mission. Clad in a sleek, tailored black suit and carrying a matching leather handbag, Rachel's appearance was an embodiment of elegance and authority. Her posture was impeccable, her every move deliberate and sure, as if every step had been taken in preparation for this very moment. She was no stranger to high-stakes situations, her life as a top-tier corporate lawyer having trained her to maintain composure in even the most challenging environments. Today, her journey wasn't just a trip to another city. It was the culmination of months of hard work and negotiation. Rachel was heading to an important business meeting with one of the largest potential clients her firm had ever encountered. The outcome of this meeting could redefine her career, and she was determined to ensure everything went perfectly. As she walked through the airport, she mentally reviewed her presentation, making last-minute adjustments in her mind, ensuring that she was prepared for every possible question. She arrived at Gate 27, the designated boarding area for her first-class flight. The area was bustling with passengers, some of whom were busy chatting with companions, while others were silently engrossed in their devices, preparing for the upcoming flight. Rachel's eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing the layout, the passengers, and the environment around her. This wasn't just about flying to a destination, it was about maintaining the image of someone who had earned her place at the top. Rachel approached the counter, holding her first-class ticket with a sense of pride. She had worked hard to get to this point, sacrificing late nights, long hours, and countless personal milestones. As she handed the ticket over to the gate agent, a middle-aged woman named Susan Miller, Rachel couldn't help but notice the immediate change in Susan's demeanor. Susan's lips pressed together as she glanced at the ticket, her eyes narrowing in what seemed to be skepticism. "This ticket doesn't look quite right," Susan said, her voice carrying enough volume to catch the attention of nearby passengers. It was a casual statement, but the tone of her voice was anything but. It was sharp, accusatory, and laden with suspicion. The words hung in the air, and Rachel felt a flicker of discomfort, but she quickly masked it with the calmness that had become second nature to her. Rachel remained composed, offering a quiet but firm response. "I assure you, this ticket is valid. You're welcome to verify it through the system." Her tone was steady, but beneath her calm exterior, she felt a rising tide of unease. Why was she being treated like this? Why had Susan so quickly chosen to question her, when the passengers around her seemed to glide through the boarding process without a second glance? Susan's eyes flicked from the ticket to Rachel, then back to the ticket again, as if searching for something, anything, that might allow her to challenge the validity of the document in her hands. After a long, uncomfortable pause, Susan finally spoke again, her words slow and deliberate. "I'm afraid I'll have to call security," she said, her voice dripping with a subtle tone of superiority. "We'll have to verify the ticket before you can board." Rachel's chest tightened slightly at the words, but she refused to show any outward sign of discomfort. She knew that reacting emotionally in such a situation would only feed into the narrative that Susan was trying to create. Instead, she straightened her back, lifting her chin slightly, and met Susan's gaze directly. "Please, feel free to call security," Rachel said, her voice steady, almost too calm. "But I expect to be treated fairly, just like any other passenger." Rachel's words were met with a slight smirk from Susan, who seemed to take an almost perverse pleasure in the tension that was now building at the gate. The nearby passengers had started to take notice, some turning their heads to watch the unfolding situation, while others whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected drama. Rachel could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she refused to shrink under their scrutiny. She was no stranger to being judged based on her appearance. It had happened to her countless times in her career, and each time, she had stood firm. This time would be no different. As Rachel stepped aside, waiting for the arrival of security, she couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in how Susan treated the other passengers. A man in a rumpled business suit walked up to the counter, his movements hurried and frantic, as if he was already late for something. Susan glanced at his ticket with barely a second thought before quickly processing it and waving him through with a polite but unremarkable smile. The difference was glaring. Susan's treatment of the man had been swift and efficient, while Rachel had been subjected to an unnecessary interrogation. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had seen this kind of behavior before in her career, subtle bias, hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism. It wasn't just the suspicion about her ticket, it was the way Susan had sized her up from the moment she walked up to the counter. The quick flick of her eyes, the slightly raised eyebrow, the way her posture had stiffened in a manner that was anything but neutral, it was all too familiar. Rachel was no stranger to prejudice. She had navigated it her entire life, but there was something particularly unsettling about being singled out in a place like this. She wasn't just being questioned as a passenger, she was being treated as if she didn't belong. The more Rachel watched Susan interact with the other passengers, the more she realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't about the ticket, it was about who she was. The fact that she was a black woman, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying herself with quiet confidence, seemed to have rattled Susan. Rachel had experienced this kind of reaction before. It was the kind of reaction that saw a woman like her, someone who had earned her place in the world, as an anomaly. To some, a black woman didn't belong in first class. And certainly not someone as self-assured as Rachel. Her heart beat a little faster now, not from fear, but from a quiet sense of injustice. She could feel the injustice seeping into every corner of her mind. But she would not let it show. Not here. Not today. Rachel stood tall, her gaze never leaving Susan as she processed other passengers. Susan's next action was to wave a woman through with no hesitation at all, offering a smile that seemed to be reserved for certain people only. A white woman, middle-aged and casually dressed, walked by without a single question. Rachel's eyes narrowed. The disparity was so glaring it was almost painful to watch. But Rachel didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She was used to navigating situations where the odds were stacked against her, and this moment at gate 27, was no different. If anything, it was a reminder of how far she had come and how much farther she had to go to fight against the biases that still ran rampant in the world. Rachel pulled out her phone and began taking discreet pictures of Susan, recording the interactions and the way she was handling each passenger. She didn't expect to be challenged like this, but she knew that she had to be prepared. Documenting everything was the first step in ensuring that the truth came to light. Susan was about to learn that Rachel Carter did not back down, no matter what. Susan, noticing the flash of Rachel's phone, snapped her gaze toward her. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. "You can't take pictures here." Rachel didn't flinch. She held her phone up calmly. "I'm documenting the way you're treating each passenger," she said in a tone that was polite but unmistakably firm. "I believe this might be useful if I need to report this situation." Susan's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained control. She sneered, as if trying to brush off Rachel's quiet defiance. "Oh, please," she said with a loud, dismissive laugh. "You're making a scene for nothing. I'm just doing my job." Rachel kept her voice steady, her eyes never leaving Susan. "If you're doing your job, then you shouldn't mind me documenting what's happening. After all, the truth always speaks for itself." Rachel was fully aware that this moment could escalate, but she was ready. She was used to standing up for herself in situations like these, and this was no different. What was happening at gate 27 wasn't just about her, it was about a much larger issue that had long been ignored. And Rachel was determined to make sure that it didn't go unnoticed any longer.